Life, wisdom.
This is Psyche Truth correspondent Karina Rachel, and I'm joined today by Dr. Colin Ross. He's a psychiatrist and author. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
And today I want to talk about James Holmes, the Colorado shooter, and what can be known. This is still a pretty recent event. What is definitely known about James Holmes at this time?
Well, all I have access to is the public media information. I don't know anything else. And from that, I know his name, that he was a neuroscience student in Colorado. And that's a very competitive program, so you got to be at least quite bright to get in there. We know that.
Right.
We know he was in the process of withdrawing, so he was off track. Something was going wrong somehow. Mm-hmm. We know that he had acquired weapons and I think it was 6,000 rounds of ammunition, mm-hmm. Mostly off the internet, and he acquired those legally. We know that he booby-trapped his apartment. Now, exactly how sophisticated that was,
right,
or whether it's been exaggerated a bit, I don't know. He clearly was present at the shooting. He dyed his hair that very odd kind of red color. And we know that he left the theater, was sitting in the car outside the theater. So that raises the question, why didn't he drive away? And we know that when he was apprehended, he told the police about the booby trap in his apartment.
Interesting.
I mean, that's kind of a quick summary of what we actually know.
Right. So essentially we're looking at someone, he also had a history of mental health. He was seeing a psychiatrist at the time, Lynn Fenton. So do we know what types of drugs he was on at the time, or what type of treatment he was under, or what her perspective on his particular state was around the time of the event?
Basically, other than he was seeing Lynn Fenton, who's a psychiatrist who was in the student mental health service at the University of Colorado, we don't really know much. We don't know how many times he saw her, don't know what kind of diagnosis. Was he on medication? What kind of medication? Was he getting psychotherapy? Basically, we don't know all that information.
Right.
Apparently, he did write a diary or some sort of manuscript, which was sitting in the mailroom for perhaps 3 days, undelivered to Dr. Fenton, but it was addressed to her. So there's an issue about if the mailroom had got on that faster and she had gotten that information, would she have done something?
Right.
Plus, we know that he must be at least fairly severely disturbed, because she reported him to an internal review board of the University of Colorado because she was concerned about his potential for some kind of violence or danger. And then it appears that they just kind of did nothing because he was in the process of withdrawing.
Okay.
That's about all we know about the psychiatry side of it.
Interesting. So in some of the research that I've done, I've also seen that the university has been very reluctant to release details about the program that he was in or what exactly he was studying. It is known that he had published an essay or had given a presentation about the biological basis of mental health disorders. What can you say in response to the fact that the university is really not disclosing very much information about the program that he was involved in?
Well, I'm sure that the university is just in a legal lockdown on the advice of their counsel, which is not surprising, because the liability that is potentially being faced here is so gigantic. So in the ideal situation, they would be letting us know all kinds of information, but that's not realistic legally.
Right.
And then that just means everybody's left speculating and waiting.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of James Holmes, he's in this neuroscience program. It's a very competitive program. He received, I think it's $26,000 grant to be a part of this program. And yet at the same time, all of this information is kind of not known about what exactly he was studying or what exactly he was a part of. What are some of your ideas in terms of what you know about multiple personality disorder, dissociative personality disorder? These are kind of some of your fields of expertise. How can you speak to maybe the role? And clearly he had a multiple personality issue going on. Would you say that?
I couldn't say anything clearly at this point. But here's what I would want to know, and here's what I would be considering. Like if I was called to examine him or review the case, either defense side or prosecution side, The sort of categories that I'd be looking at are, first of all, did he act by himself or in concert with somebody else? And was he controlled and handled by somebody else? Was it some kind of operation? So those number 1 and 2 categories. Then within the acting by yourself category, I'd want to know, since I'm a psychiatrist, exactly what seems to have been his thinking, his motivation, his mental state. And that would probably come down to, technically, legally, you can be sane and do a mass shooting because you know it's wrong and you know that it's illegal and you know you shouldn't do it. But in common sense sort of level, you have to be out of your mind to do something like that.
Right.
So there's a little discrepancy between common sense and the technical meaning of insane under the law. But you're likely to have one of 2 psychiatric diagnoses. You're either some form of psychosis like schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. And I would want to figure out which one of those, or some sort of overlap of the 2. And that would be then tied back into his motivation, his reasoning, why he did it. And I would want to know his history of trauma. If he has a dissociative disorder, what kind of childhood abuse did he experience?
Right.
If he doesn't have a dissociative disorder, only a tiny, tiny minority of people do mass shootings, obviously. So any psychiatric diagnosis by itself doesn't explain why the shooting took place. You still have to look at, what's this man's life story? How did he get from birth to being so angry, so off the rails? And who was he actually angry about? Obviously, it wasn't the people in the theater. So I'd want to know his life story and have some kind of grasp on how he got to that point, just as a human being.
Right. Because certainly there are people with a mental health diagnosis who are not engaged in this kind of violent activity. You know, certainly like as you mentioned, the diagnosis alone wouldn't explain what happened. There's certainly a lot more details to be discovered. Another factor that's been cited in this whole discussion is the role of violence in movies. And it was said that he had watched a whole lot of times this very violent trailer of some movie about Batman or some movie about murdering. I don't really know the details. What do you feel is the role of violence in the media or violence in entertainment?
Well, these are all big, complicated questions, and nobody has the exact scientific answer. But I think it's kind of a perfect storm situation. And there's usually a whole bunch of factors. So you could find 10,000 guys who watched a lot of violent video game or watched or played a lot of violent video games. Out of all those guys, only one's going to be a mass shooter. You could find 10,000 people who've had abusive, traumatic childhoods. Only one becomes a mass shooter. So there's always some sort of peculiarity of that human being you can never figure out that's in the equation. And then there's the trauma they've gone through, what they're angry about, whether they're psychotic or delusional or paranoid, feeding into things. All the role of violence in the culture. And then, of course, we get to the gun control aspect of it.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because in Colorado now, shortly after the shooting, they had a massive amount of people go out and purchase firearms in efforts to, protect themselves.
Just my personal take on it is I don't see why people have to have AK-47s and handguns anyway. But it's a huge charged issue in our culture.
It certainly is.
Another angle on this is the psychiatric medication angle, which if I was assessing them, I want to also look at very carefully. Because you can have an untreated mental health problem and be violent as a result, or you can become violent because of the medications you're prescribed. So in all of these cases, I want to know, was he prescribed an antidepressant, an antipsychotic, and what was his reaction to it? If you have somebody with no history of violence, never been in trouble with the law, and they suddenly do this kind of behavior, which is not suddenly in seconds, obviously, there's months of planning, I want to know, was it ramped up by some kind of psychiatric med that has a side effect, according to the FDA, according to the government, of agitation, homicidal thinking, suicidal thinking, delusional thinking.
Right.
So that's another factor that comes into play. And with him in particular, we don't know.
Right. Well, it's an interesting point that you bring up, that this violent behavior can actually come as a product of these drugs, or maybe not necessarily a direct consequence, but even if the person is already under psychiatric evaluation, they're in the care of a psychiatrist, they're already being treated for their mental illness, and then they commit one of these acts, then yeah, it certainly does raise the question of, is psychiatric treatment always the answer? Are these cases where psychiatric treatment is actually, not preventing this event from happening?
Mass shootings are so rare, you can't really accumulate evidence that psychiatry is either increasing them or reducing them.
Right.
Basically. And they're such rare events that as a working psychiatrist, you're not always on the edge of your seat wondering if this patient's going to go become a mass shooter.
Right.
It's such a rare thing, you can't really predict it, can't anticipate it, can't control it. The only question is, was he far enough along the pathway that really there was a duty to warn, and when the college did nothing, did she have a duty to warn the police? That's the issue. Because clearly he was a long way down this path at the point that she spoke to the school authorities.
And it's interesting that you mention, certainly these incidents of mass shootings or very extreme violence like this are somewhat rare, are somewhat isolated. But at the same time, when you look at them, there is this recurring role of the person having a psychiatric diagnosis or being under psychiatric care.
Well, we know from those labels that are called black box warning labels, because they actually have a black margin around them. So this is not any kind of conspiracy theory or radical opinion. This is the official opinion of the government of the United States through the FDA, that these SSRI antidepressants, compared to a placebo, cause an increase in suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, agitated, disturbed behavior, mixed up mental state, delusional, paranoid thinking. These are just facts.
Right.
So if we know it's a fact that those medications cause that, and we want to scan around in our culture for examples of that happening, obviously the majority of the school shooters have been on antidepressants. It's a factor we want to look at very carefully. Right. And we shouldn't be persuaded by any kind of like backpedaling or pro-drug company position on this. Mm-hmm. These medications, for a fact, are known to have these kind of toxic side effects.
Interesting.
So it's a rational, reasonable, plausible contributor.
Quite so. Well, let's talk more about that in another video. We're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you will leave a comment with your question, share it with your friends, and be sure to subscribe for our future videos where we'll talk more about the role of psychiatric drugs in these different kinds of incidents of mass shooting and violence. Thank you so much for watching.